And just reality, there's no good answer. When you're going to do a 10% layoff, regardless of how big you are as a company, there's just no good answer, right? You're really looking at
Yeah.
choosing different options, all of which have pros and cons, and making your best judgment. Welcome to the Wellable Weekly Podcast, where we talk about key topics and trends at the intersection of well-being, technology, and HR. I'm Nick, along with my good friend and colleague, Geoff. Geoff, some exciting news. This, for the first time, it feels like in weeks, this will not be an AI podcast. Hard to do. Oh, there's always
Yeah.
AI news, but I feel like we just need to go into the HR world sans another AI topic.
Yeah, that's right. Let's mix it up a little bit.
There we go. So our first article is actually interesting. I think we've talked about this kind of in different ways the last months, not just weeks. Is every week it feels like another major company is announcing some type of layoff, right? You had Meta just most recently, but Intuit, LinkedIn, Amazon, the list goes on. And it starts raising a question in the HR world of like, what's the best way to communicate a layoff? And not just like the layoff when it's actually happening, but do you give like notice in advance, right? Meta was a little bit, it's really the most dominant or kind of newsworthy layoff. They're a little bit unique in the sense that whether it's intentional or non-intentional, there was a leak at the end of
Yeah.
April that they were going to do a 10% workforce reduction. So they had to address it one way or the other. But even if they didn't, a 10% reduction was going to take effect, right? There are all these laws, the federal laws like the WARN Act, right? For those of you who aren't familiar, it's effectively if you have at least 100 full-time employees, which Meta has exponentially more than that, and if the layoffs are going to affect either 50 or more employees or at least 33% of the workforce, which would qualify here, you have to give 60 days notice that a layoff's coming effectively. You also have some I think what they call the mini WARN laws for certain states that are just a little bit more stricter, like New York and California. They have some just tighter regulations. But in short, there's some just legal requirements that you have. But looking outside of like the legal requirement, if a company knows they're going to have a layoff, what's the best thing to do? Should they announce in advance, let people get it? They're showing pros and cons. Should they just do it the day of and everyone's kind of caught off guard? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, that WARN Act sets the minimum, right? What you do above that minimum probably is the best signal of what kind of company you actually are. Probably what a lot of leaders and organizations struggle with is that productivity paradox, right? I mean, that's kind of the real tension where if you tell people early, you're being transparent and respectful, but you also just hand everybody a reason to update their LinkedIn, maybe mentally check out either intentionally or unintentionally just because of the distraction of the concern about that, right? So that's a real challenge. And I also think it probably has to do somewhat with your organization size. I mean, it can't be a true one size fits all answer. I mean, for us, right, Wellable is, for all intents and purposes, a smaller organization, right around 75 employees. So it might be easier for us to communicate something like that. But I also think, again, that's a instance where one of our core values is transparency, right? One of our 4 core values. So I hope we're never in that situation. But if we were, I think that we would lean into those core values and provide some advance notice. But again, it's easier for us to do that than a 78,000 life employer like Meta without any specifics about what department or the scale. It kind of just creates this big anxiety cloud, right? So if you are going to communicate early, specificity and how you deliver that news is really critical. And hopefully it's on your own terms too, right? Not like the example you gave with Meta where their hand was really forced because of that leak.
Exactly. And the question that the article was focused on was effectively, how do you communicate a situation like that? And that's like the wrong question in some ways, because I was trying to put myself in the shoes of a big company, right? But it still applies to some degree to companies of all sizes. Is that like, the question is, how do you design an exit that protects the business interests as well as the worker's dignity, right? Because you have like real business concerns. If you announce a layoff and give everyone ample notice, like 60 days, right? One is no one knows if they're going to be part of that layoff, right? So the details really matter. And in some cases, you may have some details. So like, for example, if you know no one from a specific department, like you're not going to touch the sales and marketing department, you can make that announcement and at least partially relieve any anxiety or fear with a certain group of people within the organization. So to the extent that you have more details, that certainly helps. But at some point, some people know they're in the general area could be impacted. And if you give 60 days notice, that's like great. But at the same time, there's a ton of anxiety. If you're like, hey, I know my department's going to be cut substantially. I feel like I'm a top performer. Does that performance level carry up to the C-suite who are making the decisions? All those type of things. There's a lot of politicking that's happening, right? Sometimes, like I think the Meta example is just so many people. It was done at truly the highest levels of the organization. So like middle level managers just didn't know what was going to happen. They didn't know if they were going to get removed either. And so, but when the situation exists where like a manager or managers are involved in a way that's going to determine who is going to get laid off, there's like politicking that's happening. There's a drop in productivity, as you noted, because people are talking not about the work they need to complete, but about what did they have? What happens if they did get laid off, right? Looking at unemployment insurance, maybe applying to jobs. All that stuff exists. And so to announce it early, you create, you do let people know, but you also create some anxiety factor. You create some security risks. People can start like saving down files or, copying over code or all that type of stuff. So there's just interest on the employer side and on the employee side that are just hard to balance. I don't know if there's a clear answer. And I think to your point, for groups that are very transparent forward, they should. That's just part of their cultural values. And you don't want to deviate from your cultural values because if you do, and the employees that remain have a bias to like the management team is going to be transparent when they want to be transparent. And that's not a good outcome either.
And you brought up the manager level, right? And I think in a situation like this, if you are providing advance notice, that's where you should invest your time and energy is in training, preparing, giving guidance to managers who are in impacted departments for how to handle those inevitable questions that they're going to get from their direct reports. Because of course the news is going to come from the top, but the real, where the rubber meets the road on those conversations is going to be at that manager level. And empowering them to be able to share enough information and in the right way, and give them some tools to actually do everything they can to keep everyone focused while acknowledging the realities of the situation, right? And hoping for the best outcome of retaining as much of the workforce as possible, but just knowing that some folks are absolutely going to be impacted.
Exactly. I think I tend to, as a paradigm for how I think about decisions, especially ones that are maybe hypothetical, is like, what is my default answer? And then I work. It's okay to not have that answer, but it's like that becomes a default, and based on that, you should like find reasons to convince yourself to change, right? Like one of the things I think about, like more as like optimism in business, is like, if someone asked, can you do something? My default answer is yes. If this happens, we should be able to deliver on it. That doesn't mean you always say yes. That's just your default answer in terms of being solution oriented and like trying to construct a positive outcome. But in some cases, you're like, this is not something we can do. It's just a no, right? In the case here, I wonder what the default answer is. I think the answer is transparency. And that's just not for our organization and the values that we hold. I think it's just in general. I think like the minute you start treating adults, right, and employees as like secrets that need to be managed, right, it's going to backfire, right? I just don't see that going well. And I think about who's left. At the end of the day, when you have a layoff, the next question, like day two, is always, what are we going to do with the current workforce? And if you weren't transparent and people are just generally aware of what happens after the first layoff, is more often than not, there's often like a second layoff and a third. Companies don't all of a sudden fix themselves after one. In the case of like really profitable companies like Meta, the reason they're having these layoffs is they need to fund major AI developments, right? And major AI infrastructure. That's not going away. And so if they caught everyone off guard, everyone I think who remains is going to ask, I don't see Meta curtailing their spend on AI infrastructure. So then there's got to be another one coming. And will I be a part of it then? And then you have a group of people who are distracted, less productive. Some of your best folks are going to go out there and look for jobs, especially if they felt a really top performer that they knew just happened to be on the chopping block.
Right.
All those things aren't good. But so I think my general answer is the default is transparency, let people know, really try to have specifics. Because I think unless you're
Yep.
truly just trying to, I mean, it can be any specifics. So the idea is like we're cutting 10% of the workforce and we're going to do that equally across the board. Everyone knows at that point, all else equal, kind of random selection, there's a 1 out of 10 chance they get terminated, right? And that's different if you're like, well, I wonder if my group, which is a big cost center, is going to get really, really decimated and we're going to lose 50% of our workforce or something. All those kind of details that you can share, obviously within reason, I think more often will provide some security and some like relief to a certain part of the population. It's not like a panacea, but it's one step in the right direction.
Right. I mean, I think it's the question of, when you have bad news, right? What do you owe the person receiving it? And sure, you could say, it's the right thing to do to be transparent for the individual who's worked at your company, but like you mentioned, there's also, I think, a business reputation element for those who are still with the company and want to trust that their employer, even if they had to make a right decision when there were no good options, at least held true to the tenet of transparency. And then the actual announcing of the news, the sharing of that information, it made me think of another article that was made headlines a little bit different. So World Cup is coming up, obviously, right? U.S. men's national team coach had to make a decision. He had an initial roster of 55 players, and coach Pochettino, I think is his name, had to cut it down to 26. So 29 guys getting some bad news that they didn't make the roster. And this made headlines because rather than calling them into his office or picking up the phone, he just sent them all an email basically saying, "Hey, sorry, you didn't make the squad." And it just felt so impersonal, right? I mean, sports.
Tone deaf.
It's tone deaf, right? Exactly. And sports transcends in so many ways, and we have sports heroes, right? And there's so many movies about great sports teams and things like that, and coaches are such an important part of so many of those stories. So to have a coach who just simply decided it would be most efficient, and I think he said it was really the right thing to do, and I kind of get his point because he said that calling or talking to somebody face to face is performative. It's about making me feel better, not the individual. I kind of get his point, but at the same time, I do think it would probably make the individual feel a little better to have it be a more personal delivery, especially in like that small team, right, parallel to a small company, and a situation where in 4 years, right, we're going to be doing this all again. There might still be players who are going to be contending for that same squad, and if he's still there, where is that trust and transparency and relationship oriented approach?
Yeah, and what's unique about this is like, I'm guessing for all those 55 people who are trying to be on the team, that was their like life goal, right? To play in the World Cup for their country was like a life goal where like, as much as we would love to believe that for most employees, right? The reality is most employees, this is a job. And it's not like they woke up when they were 6 years old and dedicated like hours and hours for decades of their life for this like kind of one culmination event, not to get, I don't know, there's even more information like tells me that you how to do that in person. That being said, I'll probably just end on this note. I feel like we often talk about questions or what to do as if what's the good answer? In just reality, there's no good answer. When you're going to do a 10% layoff, regardless of how big you are as a company, there's just no good answer, right? You're really looking at choosing different options, all of which have pros and cons, and making your best judgment. I do think there are better answers, right, amongst the various options for each company, but there's just no good answer in a situation like that. So moving on, next story, also HR related and compensation related. It's really a story around two surveys that I thought were pretty impactful. The first survey was around overemployment. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's this new concept where employees are having two jobs. It kind of rose through COVID. Everyone went remote. Hiring was like crazy. People were taking two jobs. They could fly under the radar. It still persists today, probably to a lesser extent. But the survey was 1,000 full-time employees who are, quote, overemployed, right? Just again, meaning they have two concurrent full-time jobs. And more than half of them said they would need to receive a raise of 21% to 50% just to give up the second role, right? Which is pretty substantial. Obviously, they would take a pay cut, in all fairness, but still pretty substantial. And then there's another kind of survey from Job Leads where it was saying that the expectation for salaries for U.S. workers is drastically different than the salaries that they're getting. So an average U.S. worker expects an average of $33,000 more in salary than they're getting with their new job. Pretty sizable number. And what just reflects is people are expecting or wanting more comp, especially in this day and age where prices are increasing and things like that. And their traditional 3% raise isn't cutting it.
Yeah. I feel like my takeaway here was just trust gap between employers and employees seems to be widening, right? And I'm sure some of that has existed since the dawn of time, but it is compounded by the phenomenon that you mentioned, right? This last 5 or 6 years, we were thrust into a remote and hybrid environment, and with all the ways you can stay connected and produce in different roles through digital and virtual tools, it unlocks possibilities to take on multiple roles at once. And I think the reality is we are now in a employer-friendly market. Certainly it's flipped, seemingly like a couple times, even over the last 5 years or so. But right now, with the way things are tightening and the many reductions in force that we're seeing across some of the largest, most influential companies out there, it certainly feels like the balance of power is kind of shifting more to the employer. Now, I'm not to say that there's any excusing the fact if someone is truly working multiple jobs when their employment contract states they are exclusive to that company or they should be working 40 hours, right? There's no kind of excusing that action, because again, that's transparency is a two-way street for sure. But it does feel like employers are in a position now where you have a favorable kind of position in the market. What do you do with that leverage that you have? And it's not to say that you have to fully close that gap with perceived versus actual salaries and raises, right? But it's certainly important for organizations to be cognizant of what folks are facing across rising healthcare costs, cost of living and gas and groceries. It's all going up. So helpful to be mindful of that. We'll also, again, on the individual or employee side, kind of doing things the right way, while also looking out for yourself.
Yeah, I kind of think again about like our company here and what's happening. Like up until last year, we guarantee every single employee got at a minimum a double-digit percentage increase in their compensation. Early in our history, pre-COVID, that was like extremely compelling because everyone was averaging 3%. Maybe you're at a company that was averaging 5%. But then during the heyday of COVID, we maintained that same structure that made it super competitive from a compensation perspective that now all of a sudden became kind of the norm. So the job market became so employee friendly. Companies were offering huge raises. And like, in my mind, it's like, you want to keep it steady and like try to be like a long-term reliable compensation increaser for your employee base. But you got to realize like where we struggle, like trying to hire people when the market was blowing up, we didn't get the benefit of like doing it way better when the market was down, right? Yeah. And so if you're an employer, like I understand the desire to say, okay, now this is an employer-friendly market. Like we should like lean into that benefit, because when it's not an employer-friendly market, we're not going to get the courtesy on the other side. I don't know if I like that strategy, but I certainly understand it. And the other thing that made me think about this was like, could overemployment exist at a company like Wellable, right? And I don't think it can, for a lot of reasons. One is related to a topic we cover often, is that we are hybrid. So you have to be in the office 2 days a week at our company. And like, I got to think that 2 days becomes like a real just barrier to like do 2 jobs or to be quote overemployed. And that's true. You can see why employers are saying, let's go back to return to office, right? There's a lot of reasons, I think, from a positive growth and collaboration perspective, that's why a lot of companies are doing it. But we do know this, a lot of companies do it to trim the workforce, have people opt out without having to pay severance
Sure.
and things like that. We know that some companies may even do for this. If they have a real concern that, hey, we're so big and so easy for someone to potentially do this. Now, I think the answer is the company should find a way that, like, that could not exist within their organization. Like, that's the better solution. But a quick and dirty way of kind of largely preventing it would be bringing everyone on site at least a few days a week, and that would certainly kind of prevent it.
Yeah, it seems like 2 to 3 days is kind of becoming more of that magic number. But that seems like a good place to wrap up today's pod. So thanks as always, folks, for listening. You can catch Wellable Weekly on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to subscribe to Wellable Weekly for all of our latest insights. Thank you.